All right. Hey, everybody. So, welcome to our mini lecture. And today we're going to be discussing the Colossal Olmec Heads. But specifically, John and I were very interested in the engineering that goes behind these Olmec Heads, specifically manufacturing them and actually transporting them because, they're called colossal for a reason.
So just to give you a little bit of background on the Olmec people, the Olmec were a group originating around the Gulf of Mexico who were these phenomenal stone workers. They're argued to be one of the first, if not the first, major civilization to exist within the Mesoamerica region. And specifically, they lived around what is today modern Veracruz, Mexico, in kind of the wetlands and the mountains nearby. Originated about 1800 BC is really when the civilization began to develop. One of the most well-known sites of theirs is San Lorenzo, which was kind of this massive cosmopolitan city with highly developed trade routes, resources, and religious spreadings that kind of interconnected a lot of the Mesoamerica region at the time.
Yeah. And so, some of the history behind them, people oftentimes attribute them to be the first true art makers in the ancient world because of how impressive their stone artwork really was. So there's numbers of mysteries about their art, but specifically, John and I want to look at how these colossal heads were made and then really focus on the transportation of how they were able to move these heads, all across their map, which we can see over to the right, and to all these different sites. And so, generally, though, it's believed that the Olmec tradition of their monumental art actually dates back to around 3200 BC because they discovered a small basalt carving at San Lorenzo. And so, just some more background about the colossal heads. So, each of them are very unique. They're not in a cutter fashion at all. But generally, the heads are around 4 to 11 feet in height and 6 to 50 tons in weight. And so, this further creates the mystery about how could you actually transport these giant colossal heads without, modern day technology. And so that's what we're going to investigate today. But just as an example of how they are unique, on the left, we see this skinnier, thin head, while on the right, it's wider, more round. And also, we can see different facial expressions and different headdresses. This guy has open mouth, almost a bit of a smirk or a smile, while the guy on the right has more of a frown with his lips closed. So, this is just to emphasize that when they're creating them, they're not just using some kind of base image or something. They're really going with it and creating a unique sculpture. And so a lot of the mystery comes from this site Llano del Jicaro because they discovered a type of stone which was able to actually link together all of the sites. And this is a type of basalt, cerosynthipic basalt. And so at Llano del Jicaro, they found a tabletop altar and two basalt discs. And the discs were actually identical to ones found at San Lorenzo. And so this gave archaeologists the idea that Llano del Jicaro actually exported their stone to other monumental centers like San Lorenzo and La Venta, for example. And additionally, it's important to note that this was one of the only quarries to be found yet, so that this also is good evidence that they exported their stone. This indicates that the Olmec were a lot more interconnected and organized than we would ever have thought before. And so this is a map of the area. And so towards the west, we can see Llano del Jicaro. This is their main quarrying place. And so you have Tres Zapotes, La Venta, and San Lorenzo, and all of these are at least 50 miles away from Llano del Jicaro. And so, that is really where the mystery comes from. But what we were able to unravel these mysteries using archaeology, because as I mentioned earlier, they used the same type of stone, and so that linked all of the sites together, and they were actually able to create a list like detailing all of the aspects of the process behind the monumental heads. So you start with quarrying, and then transportation these large stones to a site that's close by so they can work on it by grinding it, smoothing it, and polishing these stones. And so that creates a blank slate for them to actually carve in the face, the eyes, whichever aspects of it are needed. And then lastly is the transportation of the finished product. And it's important to note that this transportation is much longer and farther away than when they're moving it from the quarry and the excavation site to a site where they work on it. Um, and so the first step in the process is the excavation step. And so it requires a lot of manpower to get these huge rocks out of these outcrops in the face of the earth. And so the first step is to actually get the blank slate and the rock for them. And so one part of this that I found really interesting was the aspect that they actually recycled the stone that they used. So this implies that the Saracen typic basalt may have been a scarce resource at one time or another. Some of the theories behind this are to different cases of weather, rainy or hazardous weather could stop the manufacturing or the excavation of the stone because it would just be not logistic at all to try and do that. Also, political and social conflicts with other civilizations could cause the stone to be much more scarce because they would start hoarding it and placing more importance on the natural resource that it is. And lastly, there's an idea that the stone actually had a religious or symbolic purpose in their culture, which makes sense because if they hold it as something sacred, then they would want to recycle it and use it to its best value. And so the next step is the quarrying and the transportation from the outcrop to a place where they can work on it. And so there are two general ways the quarrying of a rock goes, but generally it's thought that it would be a large scale group process for the Olmec because, they're getting these huge rocks and it's not really a singular person's project, but a communal project and something for their society as a whole. So they would require a lot of manpower and to actually take a rock directly from its outcrop and then transport it to be worked on. And so one of the primary sources that I found, a colonist at Tres Zapotes said that each stone that they moved from the outcrop required around 400 men in order to transport it. And they did it by dragging the stone with ropes attached around it. Um, and so another thing that the primary source noted was that uh, a huge key factor in the transportation was that the workers were very passionate for the construction of their city and the start of their, cosmopolitan society. So that inspired them to work a lot harder and faster as well. The next step is the roughing and the flaking step. And so this is the reduction of the raw material into a blank slate, which can be used to create the monument. So that's how you get it from the outcrop into almost just a blank slate of sorts. And so they would use wood and stone picks or hammers. And some of these tools were actually found over here. And so what's interesting to me about these tools is the scale that you're given an idea of because these tools are tiny and these monumental colossal heads are huge. And so it would must have taken either a lot of people or a long time in order to, smooth and flake these massive outcrops of rocks. And so these are, more tools that they were used. And, it's really impressive that they were able to take this massive stone and move it into a unique piece of artwork using tools as small as these. And, they're not modern technology. These are simple percussion tools. Lastly, there's the polishing step, and that's where they, smooth and polish the stone to give it a better appearance, make it more shiny and smooth to the touch. And so they would use leather, corn cobs, or even other stones that functioned as polishers. But one of the primary sources I found said that they used sand and emery for carving and burnishing them, and that made them very smooth and shiny. So specifically, we know that the Olmec used emery and sand. And this is another example of one of the polishers. And once again, it gives you an idea of that scale. because these tools are so small. It must have taken them an incredible amount of time and effort in order to change it into something larger and more unique and actually pleasing to the eye. And so the summarized process before the final transport is that they first cut the rock from an outcrop and move it to a site that's closer, that's not too far away, so that they can work on it, change it into a blank slate by polishing it, flaking it, roughing it, chipping away at the stone. And then that prepares it to be actually polished and molded into their actual sculpture. And so the tools they would use are picks, hammers, pecking tools. And this is really only the first part of the process because, the real mystery comes from the final transportation because that's when they're moving it across miles and miles of land. And so that's what John is going to talk about for us.
All right. So with the final transportation, like Ian noted, it's done after the complete construction of these carvings. So there's really two main reasons behind that. The first is for weight reduction. It's a lot lighter to transport a finished product that has had several thousands of pounds of stone carved and chipped away from it than it is a massive blank slate. And another reason behind that is that way the Olmec were able to have a lot of these highly skilled stone workers at a centralized site. So that way they didn't have to be traveling from the major cities such as San Lorenzo back to La Venta and up to Tres Zapates, back and forth. They could be in a very centralized location. This is a very interesting topic to me personally, because I actually used to work in the art shipping industry. So I had access to things like cranes and flatbed trucks and forklifts, none of which the Olmec people had access to. So to me, this is kind of a very interesting topic. So here we have a map of the region the Olmec inhabited. So with the red arrow up at the top left, that's kind of the mountainous regions in the Tuxtla Mountains, where a large number of basalt deposits are found. And then a little below that, you see Llano del Chicaro. And then to the west and kind of south, to the east and southeast, you have San Lorenzo and La Venta, which are the two of the major Olmec sites. So one of the main theories about how the Olmec have been able to transport stone over these massive distances is the raft theory. And really a lot of this was pioneered by Leslie C. Hazel's research and her in-depth dive into how they would be able to do this. So as you can see, a lot of the major cities or civilization centers within the Olmec society were interconnected through river systems as well as the Gulf of Mexico. So it's a very easy jump to make to assume that the Olmec would utilize these river systems as a means of transportation of these large objects. I mean, there's a reason we still use barges and shipping freighters today. It's much easier and energy efficient to transport large objects and shipping containers over water than it is to build roads and drag things or push things. Another big supporting idea is the ocean currents that exist within the Gulf of Mexico. So most people have heard of the Gulf Stream. It's kind of a large body of warm water that flows through, originates in the Gulf of Mexico, flows around Florida, and then up the east coast of the United States. But with such a large amount of water moving out of the Gulf of Mexico, there's a large number of countercurrents that exist. Particularly, there's a cold water current going from the Mississippi River, kind of goes counterclockwise along the coast of Texas, and then down into Mexico and through Veracruz, as you can see where that is down by the black arrow there. It's important to note that the river systems that connect to the construction site are actually to the northwest of the rivers that connect to La Venta and San Lorenzo. So it's really, they would have the aid of these ocean currents pushing the rafts through the Gulf of Mexico, which is really a huge advantage in the transportation of these items. So with the rafts themselves, there's very little we have very little physical evidence of the types of rafts and canoes that the Olmec were able to produce. The main reason for this is there's really very little written, and most of it was made out of wood. And wood degrades, especially when exposed to sun and salt water over hundreds and thousands of years. But it's a very safe assumption to assume that the Olmec had access or the technology that is dugout canoes, simply because if they were able to carve these massive stone heads, carving dugout canoes is a very low technology compared to that. So it's widely accepted that they had dugout canoes, especially since pretty much every other civilization has created these at some point or another. So these canoes would have been made out of sebia trees, which are very large and indigenous trees to the region. And the rafts themselves, the logs used, would also have been made out of the sebia material, as it's very abundant and it's straight and it is very good for woodworking. So these rafts would have been 25 feet in width, 27 feet long and 4.5 feet high, just to support an average stone sculpture. Obviously, some of the smaller ones would have required a little bit of a smaller raft, and then the largest of the stone heads would have required a much larger raft, just to be able to physically have enough buoyancy within the wood to float the structure. And then this would have all been lashed together using fiber ropes. And so once the log raft had been created, it would have been dragged using teams of men in canoe. So there would have been about 72 men pulling on these fiber ropes attached to this log raft. Think of it kind of like Santa's sleigh and his reindeer is kind of a visual aid for that. So there's a lot of arguments against the raft theory. One of the biggest is the presence of tropical weather within a very tropical climate that is the Gulf of Mexico. These massive storm systems can virtually appear out of nowhere. To this day, we have a very hard time predicting them. And as you can imagine, at the time period which the Olmec inhabited, it's very difficult to try to predict these storms and when they're going to happen. So really from anywhere between May and November, these massive cyclones and hurricanes can pop up out of virtually thin air. Another topic which just really argues against the raft theory is the rivers and the inlets themselves that the Olmec would have to cross and the sandbars. So with all of the river systems and these kind of freshwater estuaries, those bring out a lot of sand and silt and deposits, and they create these large sandbars at the river mouths, which really creates difficult conditions in the wintertime. So when it's not even peak hurricane season, they're much harder to get through and traverse. And then finally, another major argument is the rope technology the Olmec had access to. So these fiber ropes, they're actually quite strong, but they begin to degrade very quickly when they're exposed to a lot of UV light and especially salt water. So as you can imagine, if you're pulling a raft a couple hundred miles, that's a lot of time exposed to light and salt that really begins to degrade and then could potentially snap. And well, if you're transporting something on land and the rope snaps, the object physically just doesn't move. It's not like, it's going to sink if you're on land. But if one of the ropes that's holding or lashing the log raft together snaps, the entire log raft can break apart and you're going to lose this incredibly valuable structure that the Olmec have spent hundreds, if not thousands of man hours already devoted to carving and finishing this project, only to lose it in a sandbar at 6 feet of water. It would really be a travesty. And that's why it's kind of theorized that the Olmec didn't use raft transportation, just because the risk of losing these carvings is so high in the water. So with that, that leaves us with land transportation. An interesting thing to note about moving these sculptures over land is that the Olmec didn't have any beasts of burden, so to say. So most other civilizations, we kind of picture having horses or ox or camels even in Africa to help pull and do these large manual labor tasks. But the Olmec didn't have any of these animals. So it was very kind of labor intensive to have to do it all with manpower as opposed to a team of horses or mules. So with that, the type of sleds they would have had to construct are very kind of rudimentary. They would have been made of essentially a couple large wooden runners. It's kind of like skis essentially, and they would be kind of built in with support beams on top, and they would have been connected to a series of fiber ropes which men would pull. That's kind of similar to, it's a drawing of the pyramids being constructed, but it's a very similar idea where you would have a large team of men pulling a very heavy object. So with this, they would have needed approximately 400 men. So some of those men would have been marching ahead, kind of clearing out a path, making a rudimentary road system through the woods, through the jungle at the time, while the others would be dragging the sculpture. This also presents a lot of challenges geographically, one of which is the monsoon climate that exists within the region. So in the summers, Veracruz, Mexico gets about 100 inches of rain just in the summer alone. To give some context behind that, Winston-Salem gets about 45 inches of rain all year. So they're getting really 4 times the rainfall. So pretty much every day from July to October, it's raining, which really limits, turns the ground into mud and turns a lot of these low-lying areas into these massive lakes and floodplains, as you can see up at the top right, where slowly these kind of ordinary rivers and maybe a pond or something turns into these deep lakes. These are really impassable. Another limit is the physical constraint of moving or dragging a large sled weighing 20, 30 tons up a hill. It's theorized that the Olmec would have only been able to drag at a 10-to-1 incline at the most, which means that for every 1 foot in elevation gained, you have to do that over 10 feet of distance, which is really a shallow gradient and really limits the hills and terrain they can move through and around. The coastline is the flattest, but that is off limits due to the presence of mangrove estuaries. So these are these tidal bays near the coast and around river systems that flood at high tide and recede to be kind of a lower marshy area. Again, not ideal for dragging a 20-ton sculpture through. So using modern technologies, LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging, it's actually something we looked at earlier in this class that's being used to map the Amazon floor to kind of find these hidden structures and civilizations that we can't see through the trees. But that's being applied here with GIS mapping to kind of pick out possible paths that the Olmec could have used to transport these large stones to the San Lorenzo Plateau. And even with all of the satellite imagery and things of that, they've really only been able to determine 2 possible paths to the San Lorenzo Plateau, and they haven't been able to find any to La Venta. And part of that is because the region around La Venta is very built up today. So there's a lot of terraforming with farming, roads, cities, streams being diverted and things like that make it really impossible to tell or theorize like the paths they could have taken to drag these stones to La Venta, which is mind-blowing to me because we can't find that with satellite imagery, and they were able to determine these paths by hand on the ground without any sort of mapping technology that we have access to today. So to conclude, the Olmec were a very, very advanced society, if not one of the first societies within Mesoamerica at the time. They were these phenomenal stoneworkers who devoted a lot of time, energy, and resources into the construction of these colossal heads. These colossal heads are some of the only real evidence we have as to behind them, but they often leave us with more mysteries and unanswered questions than they do answers. They're definitely a society we know very little about, but just based on the complexity and nature of creating and moving these heads, it tells us that they were a very stratified society with a lot of very interconnectedness and a very highly developed social structure.
Yeah, I'd basically say the same thing. This manufacturing and transportation process really goes to show how advanced they were for their time. Because we don't see monumental artwork like this in all societies, and we especially don't see it being transported over distances like they were doing through the environments that they were doing and the climates, microclimates that they must have encountered. So we really found this research that we've done to be super interesting, and we hope you guys found it interesting as well, and that you learned something new. But yeah, that wraps up our mini lecture. Here's just our works cited, and yeah, we really hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you.
Thank you.